While other branches of Christianity have several histories that cover this time period, in Protestant Bibles, there is a gap of about 400 years between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the new one. These histories are found in what is known to Protestants as the Apocrypha, and they're about the only significant references that we have for this time period. Because while a lot was happening in the world at large, the history of Judea in this time period is almost completely silent. In America, we tend to fixate on the great wars between Persia and Greece, but in Judea, they passed the people by almost completely unnoticed. The people were firmly in the grasp of the Persian Empire. By about 400 BCE, however, the Persian Empire was weakening, and Egypt managed to break free. It was during this time of Persian rule over the Jews that Aramaic became the common spoken language of the time, something that would continue through to Jesus' day. This era also saw the slow dispersal of the Jewish people around the world in what is known as the diaspora, where they set up individual little localized pockets of Jewish community that in many cases still exist today. For the Jews who remained in Israel, however, life continued fairly calmly until about the year 334, when the new king of Macedonia, Alexander, invaded the Persian Empire. 11 years later, he had conquered the Persian Empire, conquered Egypt, pushed his way all the way to India, and died at the age of 32. His empire fell apart, and Alexander's 4 main generals divided up his kingdom among them. The 2 that matter the most to us form the Seleucid kingdom in the north, in modern-day Turkey and Iraq, and form the Ptolemaic kingdom down in Egypt. For 40 years, these 2 empires fought over the eastern seaboard of the Mediterranean, and Judea was tossed back and forth like a hot potato until it finally came to rest under the control of the Ptolemies in Egypt. Alexander had spread the Greek language and Greek culture everywhere that he'd conquered, and under the Ptolemies, that was slowly starting to filter into the Jewish life as well, as they started to accept bit by bit Greek life and Greek culture. Without really any aristocracy or ruling class, but some amount of freedom of religion, the Jewish priesthood began to take on a larger and more important role in the life of the community. Not just a spiritual one, but a political role as well. The high priest especially became an incredibly important figure in Jewish life and a political appointment. During this time period as well, the Torah and other books of the Old Testament began to be translated from Hebrew into the Greek language down in Egypt, which shows the incredible importance both of the diaspora, that it was made for Jews living in Egypt, and the importance of the Greek language in the world and culture at large. After about 100 years of relative peace under the Ptolemies, the Seleucid Empire invaded Egypt and Judea twice. During the second invasion in 168 BCE, the new Seleucid Emperor, Antiochus Epiphanes IV, which means God manifest, was met by a single representative of the new upstart empire from the west, Rome. This ambassador told Antiochus that he needed to stop attacking Egypt or consider himself at war with Rome. He then drew a line in the sand around the Seleucid king and said that he needed to make up his mind before leaving that circle, whether he would be at war with Rome or go home. Antiochus decided to go home, showing the power of Rome in the process. Returning to Judea, Antiochus found that a fight had broken out over who would be high priest, with a conservative ousting his own personal pick for the position. And he took out all of the powerlessness that he had felt when facing Rome on the people of Judea, killing 40,000 people and enslaving another 40,000. Antiochus outlawed the practicing of the Jewish religion, made circumcision a crime punishable by death, and required that everyone sacrifice to the Greek gods. Antiochus himself even went so far as sacrificing a pig on the altar in the temple of the Lord. Many scholars think that this act of defilement is what Daniel was talking about when he mentions the abomination of desolation. These were pretty big changes and really harsh punishment if you didn't follow them, but for the people who had most readily accepted Greek ideas and Greek culture, this wasn't a big step, and they accepted it fairly readily. But then, like today, the most conservative elements in a community tend to be the most rural, and these rural conservatives rose up in a revolt. Led by a seemingly endless supply of members of the Maccabee family, the people fought a guerrilla warfare until 164 BCE, when they managed to retake Jerusalem and rededicated the temple to God. Side tangent, even though the revolt was seen by the devout as God ordained, there are no obvious miracles mentioned in any of the histories except during the rededication of the temple, when one day's supply of oil lasted for 8. This miracle is still celebrated by the Jews today in the Festival of Lights, or Hanukkah. It took the people another 20 years before they were recognized as a mostly independent nation, and Jonathan Maccabeus was proclaimed both king and high priest of the people. This dual role of both high priest and king went against so much of their own history that they had to drag out a really obscure passage in Genesis to justify it, creating an obsession with Melchizedek, the original priest king, that continued into the New Testament, which is why it is mentioned so much more than it warrants in the New Testament. This war had been a triumph of traditional beliefs over new Greek ones, allowing the people to worship the Lord freely again. But this crushing of secularism came at a cost. It created an isolationist mentality for the people of Israel, carrying with it a belief that reform was not possible, collaboration with the outside world was not possible, that only strictly following the law brought freedom. And you see this mentality in the time of Jesus with how rigidly the Pharisees followed the law. Cracks started to show up fairly soon in this arrangement of the priesthood also being the rulers. Religious factions started to grow incredibly strong and have political power. Sadducees and Pharisees were fighting back and forth for who could control the country. Eventually, civil war broke out, right unfortunately at the time when Rome was wanting to expand eastward and was embroiled in a series of civil wars itself. Judea became a pawn, and in 63 BCE, it became a Roman vassal state. 23 years later, the Romans appointed a man, Herod, to be king of the Jews. Now, this man wasn't part of the royal line. In fact, he wasn't even a Jew, and the conservative elements felt themselves again under the thumb of a foreign power. Now, Herod the Great recognized this feeling in them, and he spent his entire life trying to overcome it, trying to prove that he was a Jew by doing grand and amazing things for the country, mostly enormous building projects, including the renovation of the temple of the Lord. But Herod was never fully accepted. The people wanted a real king of the Jews. They wanted a priest king like the ones that they had known just a generation before, and they felt that if they just followed the law closely enough, that God would provide someone like that, even if it took some violence to get into power. It was that world that Jesus was born into, with a terrified King Herod, ready to kill anyone who seemed like he could become an actual king of the Jews. With people ready for a savior who would use force, who would bring them freedom, who would be a priest king like they had known before, someone on the order of Melchizedek. All of these things and more played into the people's expectations of who Jesus would be and what they wanted from him. I hope you enjoyed this overview of the intertestamental period. Have a wonderful day. See you next video.